Hi, everybody, and welcome to a great week. Joanne.
Okay. Hello to everyone and welcome. I'm actually in snowy New York, and it's sort of the wonderful first snow where everything is kind of muffled and silent, and it's kind of wonderful. So that's where we are right now. Kind of opposed to fluffy, wonderful snow. Today we're going to be talking about bullying and the power of bullying in politics, and what kind of power it gives and how it affects institutions as well. And I'll explain much more about that once we get going. But before we plunge into bullying, I must turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game and will mention a very cool event that the National Council for History Education is sponsoring.
Very, very excited. Well, good morning, everybody. The rules of the game are as follows, and as usual, for those of you who are new, we encourage you to use chat to put in any questions, comments, points of concern, anything that happens to be on your mind. Just please try to keep it germane to the conversation, of course, family friendly. And as a reminder, I'm remembering right now to make sure it goes to all attendees and panelists so that everybody can see it. Unless you're a Zoom bomber, in which case don't write anything at all. If you have questions for Joanne as we get going, please put them in the Q&A. That's where we'll take questions from everybody. So in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, go ahead and click that, put in your questions, and make sure that you ask many questions, because my usual threat is in effect, which is if you don't ask questions, Joanne's going to be stuck answering my questions, which are, of course, not nearly as good as your questions. So with that, I will turn it back over to Joanne, and we will have a fantastic day today.
Okay, excellent. I'm gonna move this a little out of the way. See, I get distracted by all the chatting and I want to chat back. Okay, welcome. As I said at the outset, I know it seems like a number of you have just joined. We're going to be talking about bullying as politics today. And you know, I sometimes have a problem with the word bully, because on the one hand, when we think about it, I think we tend to associate it with schools and bullies in schools and bullying of kids and the real problem of bullying and the power that that has and the crises that that has caused. But I think that's where we associate that word. And so I think sometimes when you apply the word bully to adults, it doesn't quite mesh, although I think it's quite appropriate, as you're going to hear today. And somehow, when you use bully in an adult modern sense, it somehow suggests that people being bullied, I don't know, are weak somehow. Anyway, the dynamics of bully and adults don't necessarily mesh well, I think, in our particular century. Whatever we talk about the people being bullied, the fact is that bullies themselves pretty much are despised wherever they are. And by bullying, I'll start out by saying, by bullying, I really mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It can be verbal. It can be threatening in some way. Basically, behavior that is intended to intimidate, threaten, silence, push someone into fear so that you can control their behavior in some way. So it doesn't have to be physical. And indeed, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, sometimes it only needs to be physical once or twice. And then after that, you can rely on fear, but I'll come back to that. As I just noted, newbie has things to say too. As I just noted, bullying really works on or is fueled by emotion, right? A fear of its victims or potential victims, intimidation of its victims or potential victims, and the humiliation of victims and potential victims. And that latter one might not seem important enough, but I think it is, and I'm going to come back to that too. But I think when we look at politics, and particularly a democratic politics, bullying has a real power, particularly the humiliation component, because in a democratic politics, it's grounded on public opinion. Politicians, their careers, their power, wherever they are and back home, relies on public opinion. So if they are humiliated on a national stage, and now given social media, an international stage, that can have an impact on their career in addition to whatever personal impact it can have. And that has always been true. And it's part of the reason why this kind of behavior, even if we don't use the word bullying, but we just talk about humiliation and threats and nastiness, has a little bit of extra power when you're talking about a democratic politics, because it's all grounded on public opinion, and all of those things can be done in front of an audience, particularly given social media. Many moons ago, and I'm going to grab it here, many moons ago, I talked about a document, it might have been the second or third week when we did this, that starts out the most recent book that I just wrote, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress on the Road to Civil War. And I'm bringing it back. At the time, I used it as a way of showing the power of violence in Congress and the kind of response it evoked. And I found it a really moving document. It stayed in my mind. It ends up starting the book because I think it has such power. But the point of this document, I'm going to explain it very briefly, and then I'll go back to delving into bullying a little bit more up close and personal. The document also shows the impact of bullying. So it's a memorandum. It's signed by 3 members of Congress, and they all are basically talking about the fact that they and other Republican congressmen in the 1850s were being bullied, were being insulted, were being silenced through intimidation. In one way or another, Southerners particularly were trying to humiliate, threaten, insult, and silence Republicans. Now, in this letter, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, although they call it, in their words, deep humiliation and gross personal abuse. And here, really what they're talking about is insults. It is verbal bullying. They talk about the fact that in front of the whole nation, these Southerners were insulting them and assuming that they weren't going to fight back because they were Northerners, they didn't believe in dueling, they didn't want to engage in that kind of behavior. And as these 3 men testify, it was humiliating. They even say it hurt their manhood, because they were basically in front of the nation being slugged verbally over and over again by these Southerners and felt unable to respond. The document, what it explains is that their ultimate response to this imbalance of power, and that's a theme I'm going to come back to, their ultimate response was to meet, the 3 of them separately, and to decide that they couldn't stand it anymore. It was too personally humiliating. And because they were silencing themselves, they were depriving their constituents of their full rights in Congress. So for all of those reasons, the 3 men decided they're not going to be bullied anymore, and that when they are bullied and the next person, Southerner, who tries to bully them, they're going to announce they are willing to fight back. They are willing to fight duels. That they say, I think they say, they use the word ostracism, right? That they would be ostracized for this kind of behavior, they assume. And they also assume that it doesn't matter, that that's worth it to them for their sense of themselves and for their sense of their cause and for their sense of the rights of their constituents. So they sign this document and say, this is what we did. And in fact, although the bullying doesn't stop, it's toned down. These are men who, one of them comes to the Senate with a gun, making it very clear that he's quite willing to fight. So these 3 men who really testify in this document, I'll hold up a bad photocopy of it just so you can see it. Let's see if I can. It's a bad photocopy of part of this memorandum. The document is profoundly moving because it's so personal and so emotional. And it ends by saying, and this is the part that when I found it made me as a historian sort of tear up. They say that they're writing down these facts in this document because they want posterity to understand how hard it was to fight slavery on the floor of Congress in the 1850s, how hard it was, how personal it was, and what they had to do to fight it. They want the future to be able to read this and understand that. So in a sense, they were speaking to posterity, right, including me as a historian, trying to say this situation was more difficult than you might think. It was difficult, it was painful, it required sacrifice, and it mattered. Our fighting against slavery in this way mattered as well as other ways in which we and other people fought. So that's a profoundly moving document that, in a sense, in addition to being a great document to talk about violence in Congress, is also a great document to talk about bullying and the impact of bullying. So in the book that I most recently wrote, The Field of Blood, what that book shows is basically between 1830 and 1860, Southerners in Congress, and for the first half of that time period, there were Southerners in both parties, but still it was Southerners who were the bullies, but there were Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats, but still the Southerners used bullying, used threats, used their willingness to fight duels to basically have extra power on the floor. They threatened people, they threw insults around, they would kind of suggest that they were willing to duel at any point, and it had an impact. And what the book shows is that that dynamic of one side basically saying over and over and over again, we're willing to fight you, we'll fight you here, we'll fight you outside, we don't care if it's against the rules, we throw out the rules. What we want is, and of course to them, our rights, like you can't attack us this way, we want our rights and we're going to do anything we need to do to preserve them. Southerners end up for the first half, well, for most of this period before the Civil War, with extra bonus power on the floor of Congress, not only because of the 3/5 compromise, but also a kind of cultural power, because they are wielding this threat of bullying and humiliation to, in their hope, and they're successful at it, intimidate and silence, to basically get Northerners to silence themselves, which they do for a while. So within Congress itself, even though they're breaking the rules, this is accepted, partly because it's a matter of manhood, partly because initially Southerners are in both parties and the parties are looking to promote themselves. It was a little, the bullying was a little bit more even when there were Southerners in both parties, but what eventually happens, of course, is the issue of slavery becomes more heated as the nation expands. And with that, you end up with essentially what the Republicans, a Northern party, and the Democrats, a Southern party, you end up with North versus South rather than Whig versus Democrat. And then when you have sectional divisions like that, this question of who has power and who doesn't becomes even more extreme, because now in a sense you have the bullies versus the non-bullies. This is happening in the early 1850s, even before the Republicans come along, but still. So the dynamic goes along for a while with one team, I call them teams in this Twitter thread I just sent out, one team basically flaunting the fact that they don't follow the rules, and the other team not breaking the rules, insisting that the rules are important, trying to follow the rules, trying to shame the violators or insist that they get punished, but never being entirely successful, partly because they're often not in a majority. Even when they are, again, this is a matter of manhood, so getting the rules enforced always ends up being a little tricky. So what you end up with, and this is what I was tweeting about earlier today, and at the end of my comments here, I'm going to swing back around to it. What you end up with is one group that violates rules, threatens, intimidates, and another group that tries to follow the rules and wants the other group to behave and sort of tries to shame them for not behaving, but is still following the rules. And clearly that's an imbalance of power, right? And even more than that, and this is some of what we're seeing now, and this is some of what I was thinking about this morning. When you have one party that is basically the bully party and another party which is trying to be the rules party, you end up with, let me back up. The rules party ends up, in a sense, taking responsibility for upholding an institution. And so what you end up with is even as they're bullying and doing whatever they do, people on team bully keep pointing to the other team and saying, you're not being civil, how dare you? You're not behaving, you're not following the rules, which seems ridiculous because they're not following the rules themselves. But in a sense, this team has taken on, in their rhetoric and in their behavior and in their belief system, responsibility for the rules. And so they feel that they have to uphold them. Again, imbalance of power. And nowadays, again, we see, particularly this week, we see people who have been, going to be walk gingerly here, people who have been kind of open with some bullying behavior, now scolding the other side for doing things that sound harsh or critical or like they're bullying, right? So this is a moment that we're in where suddenly, how is that possible that these people who have been very aggressive with that kind of behavior and language are suddenly scolding other people for doing it? It's this kind of balance of power. One team that's responsible or feels responsible for institution and rules and the rule of law in a sense, and the other team that basically doesn't. Now, what's interesting about this, I have written down here, what does this mean for us? I don't have a solution to that question. I honestly don't necessarily know, but I do want to mention something about how people in this time period, how some of them successfully dealt with this kind of bullying. And I should say, bully is the word that they used to describe these kinds of politicians. So, not only is it our word, but Bully Brooks, Preston Brooks, who caned Charles Sumner, he was referred to as Bully Brooks, and it has this precise meaning. But people who were particularly effective in this atmosphere before the 1850s were abolitionists, or at least some of them. And that makes perfect sense, right? Because the people who are going to be most bullied are going to be these aggressive, upfront anti-slavery proponents, right? The Southerners who are bullies are above and beyond anyone else are going to want to silence those people. So if you're an aggressive, loud abolitionist in this time period, many of them had to have a kind of strategy to cope with the fact that they knew they were going to be attacked in some way. And the most effective ones on the floor of Congress all kind of had a strategy that they used that kind of befuddled the Southerners who were attacking them. And I want to just give you 3 examples because it's kind of striking when you look at it. In my book, I call these kinds of men abolitionist toreadors because in a sense, they sort of wave a red flag and know that they can, basically pull away the flag and the Southerners will charge and they can say, well, look at these barbarians, silly them. They're very good at manipulating culture and rules to fend off bullies, but they all clearly use one particular strategy to do this for themselves. So an example, John Parker Hale of New Hampshire. He's an abolitionist, an early abolitionist in Congress. He's not shy about it. He's attacked, but because of the kind of person he was, and apparently he was a very jovial sort of individual, a lot of people liked him. He was known for his joking, for his general good humor. He was really effective at twisting around something that a bully threw at him and using humor to defeat it. And basically, a Southerner would stand up and say something about him, and Hale would, to an extreme, ask questions or make suggestions until the whole room would break into laughter, and the red-faced Southerner would feel, his bubble of outrage would burst, and he'd kind of sit down and be a little deflated. There's one instance, for example, when someone accuses him of something. I want to say it's Henry Foote, who's just a troublesome Southerner, but at any rate, a Southerner accuses him of something, and Hale says, interesting word. Let's look up the meaning of that word. Can someone here, is there, some staffer here who could bring me a dictionary so that we could look up that word and we will all understand the meaning together, which he does. Someone brings a dictionary. He reads out the full definition. There are as with any dictionary, sample sentences of how the word is used. And as he's reading them out loud, they themselves become a topic of humor. And meanwhile, the guy who's offered the insult is beginning to sink down in his seat because, the momentum he had roused is going away and he's beginning to look more and more foolish. Ultimately, the whole room is laughing along with Hale. And that's the end of that. That just diffuses everything. So Hale was great at that, and he did that repeatedly. Then you have someone like John Quincy Adams, also abolitionist, knew he was going to be attacked aggressively, kind of invited that attack aggressively because he, in a sense, I don't mean this quite literally, but I almost do, was bulletproof when he came back to Congress, when he came to the House after his presidency. He was elderly. He was an ex-president. He was the son of an ex-president and a founder. He was not a person that you were going to challenge to a duel or beat to a pulp in any way, although there were threats. And he knew that because to a certain degree, he was immune to actual physical violence, he used that and kind of taunted Southerners and combined that. Newby really does not like the bullying. Yeah, Newby, I know. It's very distressing. Combined that kind of immunity with his really deep knowledge of parliamentary rules to sort of a double whammy of really being aggressive and then using the rules to shut people up or protect himself. And he did that again and again and again. And he actually, in some cases, would deliberately say something provoking, knowing that that was how the dynamics of this were going to work out. Another person who did that is Joshua Giddings of Ohio. His strategy in Congress was pretty much brute force. He was a big man. He was a powerful man. He was not physically afraid of many people. He was clearly willing to fight back. And he really is the most aggressive abolitionist toreador. He literally would say things that were explicitly insulting to Southerners, banking on the fact that someone, one of them, was going to stand up and run at him with a cane or try to hit him or something. There would be a flash of violence in some way. And he would then essentially step aside and say, as I suggested before, ladies and gentlemen, the barbarians of the South. And again, deflated Southerner sits down. He wasn't afraid of that kind of behavior. And he used his the fact that he calls it, I think in a letter to his wife, it's a sport. Doing this, he calls it sport because he really physically is not afraid. But the point of all of this is these people knew that they were going to be bullied. They had a strategy so that not only could they fight off the bullying, but they could kind of stand up to it. And they stood up to it for the most part. Maybe Giddings is a little bit of an exception, without being the kind of nasty, aggressive, physical bullies that were attacking them. It was really effective. And that's striking, worth considering. I don't, as I was preparing this morning, I was trying to think, what would I say would be a good strategy for today? I don't have an answer to that necessarily yet. Maybe in our discussion, we will get that. But it's worth knowing that having a strategy so that you could stand up and be aggressive against these bullies mattered. So, we're in this moment where there's a lot of pearl clutching by people who have been pretty free and easy with language and behavior for a while. Much like the discussion, the way that I'm talking about the 1850s and before, they are scolding the other side that does not engage in that kind of behavior when the other side seems to violate it, because that's not the way things go. That's not the way the other side operates. The other side claims it's about civility and unity. So how can they use this kind of language? They can't. They're hypocrites. We will now attack them with more bullying. That's part of what we're seeing here, is that imbalance of power and an attempt to use it politically in this moment. The question for us now is, what does that mean about what the Democrats should do as they come into power? Does it mean that they should just preach a message of unity? I don't know. Does it mean that they should strategically preach a message of unity and basically prove or show that they're quite willing to stand up for what they believe in, but that they want to promote unity? Based on the behavior I'm showing here, that might be a more effective message. As I said, I'm a historian. I don't have the answers here, but the pattern of behavior, the imbalance of power, the way that that worked, and the fact that there's a similar dynamic in operation now, all of that is really worth considering. One last point that I want to make, which actually isn't directly related, but I thought of it this morning, and we'll see what you think of it as well. I thought about people who all the time we see that they, and particularly, not always, but often it's people on the right claiming they're being canceled. And then they talk about being canceled in a billion press outlets. And then people say, well, you're not being canceled, right? You're all over the place. Everyone can hear you. I think, in a sense, canceled doesn't mean silenced. It means humiliated. It means publicly humiliated. Again, that gets back to where I started. There's a real power in being publicly humiliated. So canceled is kind of not the right word. These people are saying, I'm being publicly humiliated. People are trying to silence me. Basically, I'm being bullied and I won't be. And so I'm going to go out and speak and defend myself against these bullies. It's canceled hides, I think, the dynamic of what's going on there. Anyway, I'm running out of time, I see, and I want to open things up for questions. So I am going to stop there. Matt will now reappear and we can open this up for discussion. Of course, before we do, for those of us here, for new folk that have beamed in, every week, and I got to wipe off my lipstick, darn it. Every week, there's a tradition, actually two traditions. One of them is that I have a mug that is related to the theme being discussed. The other one is that Matt has a background that's related. He will come to that momentarily, but actually Newbie is very effective in helping this mug be thematic today. It's my Newbie mug. Because he bullies his way into so many conversations that I just thought, Newbie, I dedicate this bullying episode to you, even though you don't even know you're a bully. So yeah, people who don't know, Newbie has his own mug that is actually on sale. I've now done a commercial advertisements. You too can have, but at any rate, that's the mug for today's episode. Matt, I will turn things over to you for first the background and then open things up for questions.
Yeah, so folks who weren't here at the very beginning, I am broadcasting from my office on our University Center campus today, and so my background is hyper reality, which is very appropriate for bullying. However, I did come up with one. It looks really bad, which is why I don't have it up behind me. So I'm gonna show it to you really briefly. Please note the floating art in the middle of the room, which is always fun. So this is my background for the day. I love the fact that my head is now, detached from my body. So anyway, this is my background. This is, it is Teddy Roosevelt, the house that he lived in. Yes. The house he lived in right before he died. So Somerville Hill,
I do not know, but
hang on.
Tom has said, Sagamore Hill.
Sagamore Hill, thank you. Sagamore Hill.
Carol Lee is saying, as we were saying before, Matt, that she loves the floating.
The floating art is my favorite feature. So anyway, so I'm gonna turn this off so I don't freak people out, but this was my background for the day. And in the future, I will be back with my green screen so we can have lots more fun with it. So, and all right. So, and by the way, on the mug note, just so you know, of course, we have the Newbie mug, but we also have several other mugs, and I've designed a couple new ones, which are good, which are now available. John has designed another new one, which is also now going to be available. So more mugs you can purchase along with some more swag. So I will, we're working hard on trying to add stuff to the store before Christmas. So.
Well, now we know when this is done what I'm going to be doing.
and one pertains to a question that I have for you today, actually.
Okay.
So this is going to be our segue.
Makes you a little
this has
nervous.
nothing to do with what you talked about today. So, but it pertains to one of the mugs. My question is, who shot first, Hamilton or Burr? Do you know?
Um,
I know it's up for dispute. I'm wondering
it
what
is
your
up for
what your take
dispute.
is.
I will say, evidence suggests, let me think about this one moment, because there's a trial at which people who were near the ground heard what was happening. Suggests that Hamilton shot first, because what people said they heard was a shot, a pause, a shot.
Mhm.
So Hamilton is hit. So you wouldn't think that if he was hit, there'd be that, you know,
The second shot.
pause. So, but no one's really sure. We're also not sure where he was shooting. He does suggest that the first time he exchanges fire with Burr, that he's not going to fire at Burr. If they have a second exchange of fire, he's then not so sure he might shoot at him. So it's possible he shot first and aimed high, and then Burr killed him. But we don't know for sure. And this 2 seconds never came to absolute agreement on precisely what happened on the dueling ground.
So the reason I asked, I'm going to share this with you, with everybody now. So this was the mug. And on the back, of course, is.
Oh my gosh.
So
wow.
I thought that would be, I thought you'd enjoy that. I was revealing that to you today.
Wow. Okay. Well, now we really know where I'm going to be. After this.
I thought you'd enjoy that. So back to questions, much better. Annie, I saw your question. Connect with me at the end after we're done talking, and I will talk to you about that, okay? Let's see. We have 5 questions in so far, and I'm sure other people will put stuff in. Irene wants to know, what sense of history do you think presidential candidates or presidents should have? And especially, how do you think about how non-white and or non-male presidential candidates will have a sense of history? But I think let's start with the first question. What sense of history do you think presidential candidates or presidents should have?
Okay, the first question, first of all, they should have a sense of history. Any sense of history. But it's important for a number of reasons, right? And we can talk about the depth of that knowledge, but it's important to have an understanding of how we got to where we are, and to understand that further back than 10 years, right? To have a broad understanding of the dynamics of things in American history, like race, like civil rights, to have a broad understanding of the pattern and how we've gotten to where we are, because the only way anyone with a lot of power is going to be able to think of a strategy that really addresses what's going on is if they understand where that came from and what built it in some way. Now, what that means, I can't tell you. Does it mean that there should be, historical advisors to presidents, or should they have a general understanding in some way? That I'm not going to necessarily have an instant answer to, but it's important because it really defines who we are. A while back, I was being interviewed by a reporter, and this was she asked this a related question to this. Why is it important that a president knows history? And my answer to her was something like, let's say you become the CEO of a big company. You beam in, you haven't been part of the company before. Wouldn't you want to know the history of how that company got to where you are? Wouldn't that be the most effective way for you to understand the power you have and how people might respond to it? You need a knowledge of the past to address the present. And the reporter actually was like, oh, I was like, hey, a teaching moment. But that's part of the answer. I think not just because it's nice to have historical knowledge, it's practical knowledge. And we can't address the present without the past. We can't.
Excuse me, Dave, I just want to say great questions. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to them just because sort of their political nature in the present, but I will try to reframe them if we have time here at the end. Tom P wants to know, would you call Thaddeus Stevens an abolitionist toreador?
Oh, interesting. In a way, yes. He had a kind of he was kind of fearless, and he had a kind of dry wit that had a real power to it. And he wasn't afraid of deploying it in some way. So it might not necessarily have been as aggressive as Joshua Giddings being willing to fight, or John Quincy Adams, basically saying, come on and come and get me because I know you won't. Or Hale making these big, loud, room-wide jokes. But, an example that I suppose you could makes him a toreador. When at one point there was a vote involving slavery taking place, and a lot of Southerners basically left the room and went to the Congressional Library just to not be present, right? They didn't have to vote. They just absented themselves. And then what Stevens says once the vote is done out loud, he says, someone go to the library and bring the Southerners back. The vote is over and it's safe. So, he announces pretty much what's happening. But he does it with this kind of dry wit. So yeah, I'd say I'd put him in that camp as an abolitionist that you don't necessarily want to mess with. But there can be a pretty big spectrum of behaviors that gave abolitionists power.
Bill Moseley, not sure if I'm saying that right. Of course, I think you probably saw the exchange between Senator Johnson and Senator Peters yesterday. And so I'm going to reframe Bill's question. He wants to know, was that a bully session? But I'm going to reframe this into a more historical question. Was behavior like you saw between Senator Johnson and Senator Peters yesterday, is that a common historical occurrence in your estimate?
You have to actually repeat it for me because I was clearly not tuned into anything much yesterday. So
okay, then. Well, then this may not be a good question.
No, I want to know.
So Senator Johnson and Senator Peters had a heated exchange about some of the in session, one of the committee sessions regarding general political behavior in the last, let's say, 6 weeks or so. So with that said, since you're not aware of it, we're going to skip the question, but the question sort of for you to ruminate on as you go back to your everyday life, that is, was that kind of exchange between two senators really heated and angry about sort of politics, something that was brought to the floor historically in your estimation? So,
I mean, the short answer is yes. As far as exchanges in the House and Senate, in the House, heated exchanges more often led to punching and caning, and the Senate more often was about humiliation and the occasional duel. So there was a different character in the two houses, but yeah, those sorts of exchanges, heated exchanges, happened. If you look at the congressional record, one of the things I did when I was trying to collect examples of bullying or violence is I would go to the congressional record, and just generally you can see these long soliloquies, these speeches, and then sometimes you'll see suddenly a shorter passage, and then a shorter passage, and then short, and then a line, and then a line, and it's very clear that two people are now at it. So I would look for those places and say, like, oh, what's happening there? And very often that would be a moment where people were having the sort of exchange that we're talking about here. And then the question would be, do they somehow sit down without anything happening? Do others join in? Is there a threat of some kind? Often if it really does seem threatening, that becomes a point. We love our Congress, where in the House, congressmen would jump up on their desks to watch because they knew something bad was going to happen if it kept proceeding the way it was going to proceed. But so the short answer is yes.
Do you think that those exchanges, or the bullying in general, do you think it reflected sort of the qualities of the House and the Senate, like their sort of character? The House is supposed to represent the people, Senate's supposed to be sort of above the fray. What did the bullying and along those, did it reflect those kind of sensibilities as well in here?
Well, definitely the two houses had a different sensibility. And I suppose some of it is that maybe the House was seen as being closer to the people, but more than that, the Senate was a smaller, more intimate institution as a body. So it was very different to the House is crowded, overcrowded, crammed into a space that wasn't meant to have that many people in it. It has a wider spectrum of people socially in it. You have to be louder and more aggressive to sort of get into the conversation. The Senate is smaller, more intimate, and there's a kind of, I don't know, a tradition of etiquette in the Senate, so that sometimes people cross the line for sure. But usually when they do, someone stands up and says something about, gentlemen, the tradition of the Senate. What about the tradition of the Senate? Which might not do anything, but at least that's kind of hovering there.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, it's for me, it's always fascinating, that idea of the tradition of the Senate is such a wonderful idea, right? That there's supposed to be sort of this decorum that underlies everything they do, even when they're being horrible to each other, right?
I want to answer Richard's question here, actually.
Oh, yes, please do.
Put it in the chat. Do you think the factors discussed this morning are part of the reason why some Southerners underestimated the manhood, courage, heroism of Yankee hirelings later when the war began? And interestingly, I think that certainly contributed to it because, for example, I found a transcript of a speech that a Southerner made shortly before the war. And he basically says something along the lines of, we've seen these people in Congress. We know what they are, right? They're not threatening in any way, right? This is, so yeah, I think they did in some ways play, again, that's, I suppose, still more bullying, but yeah, I think people didn't necessarily say, well, now we know Northerners are weak, but that certainly fed into whatever the larger rhetoric was about, war is going to be nothing, we're powerful, they're weak and scared, it'll be over soon.
And thanks for catching that. Folks, the question and answer box right now is over my chat, so I'm not catching a lot of what's going on in chat. So
okay, I'm staring at chat, so if something.
Thank you, Joanne, for catching that. I just see whatever is last as long as it's there. That's all I'm seeing on chat. So
that was just a really good question.
So do put your questions in Q&A, because that was a fantastic question. Curtis wants to know, was there someone that was supposed to play referee between the two parties in these disputes to enforce the rules, or were the parties just left to hold each other accountable?
Well, yeah, I mean, the person presiding over the body, right? So the Speaker of the House is supposed to be the person acting as referee. The problem with that is speakers in this time period, first half of the 19th century, are not unbiased in any way, right? They're very much party driven. I mean, Henry Clay, sometimes would step down onto the floor and take part in debate and then get back up and act as speaker. Number one. Number two, manhood was involved in a certain way. So also that sometimes the speaker couldn't jump in because two men were going at it, and the assumption is let them go at it because it's a fair fight. And then sometimes it was just impossible to do anything. There are lots of instances of something happening in the room, and witnesses say that the speaker was just there banging his gavel to absolutely no effect, like gentlemen. So yeah, supposedly the person presiding over the body is supposed to have that kind of control, but we're talking about a system throughout this period that by definition says rules don't always apply. So even if there's someone willing to enforce them, that's kind of iffy. John Quincy Adams had a name. He said that every time one of these things would happen and the rules would be broken and someone would stand up and say, what about the rules? Why aren't we enforcing the rules? He called those lamentation speeches. There would be some kind of episode and he would say in his diary, and now the lamentation speeches begin. Tells you how effective they were, not very effective.
It also tells you a lot about his sense of humor. That is fantastic.
I know.
I love it when you get those little pieces. You find somebody that's just hilarious, like in their, in history,
Can I offer you another John Quincy Adams example?
Yeah, please do, because that was great.
Yeah, which is kind of, along similar lines. He, like I said before, like he knew and often tried to set off Southerners and slaveholders. And there's one instance, actually, Joshua Giddings tells this story about John Quincy Adams. There's one instance in which he stood up and objected to something, I think, that he shouldn't have objected to. It wasn't his time to do it. And the house erupted and they were screaming and the Southerners were howling and he was standing there amidst this chaos. And when it reached a peak, he just suddenly like sat down and the entire room got quiet. And Joshua Giddings said he was just howling with laughter at his seat because he was like, he got them all riled up. And then he just sat down and they all became quiet. So he's an interesting character, John Quincy Adams.
Oh my goodness. Vince wants to know, would senators bully incoming presidents into cabinet picks?
Oh, interesting. Well, there was occasional bullying of presidents. That's tricky because the president has more power. But there was bullying. I'm not going to remember which president it was, but I remember coming across an instance of someone threatening the president, and nothing really happening. More often than not, you have a president, and this is particularly true, surprise, of Andrew Jackson, saying something that makes it clear he would like some of his supporters to do some bullying on his behalf. So Andrew Jackson, the most extreme example. There's, what is the name of the guy? Oh man, this is gonna destroy the story if I can't remember the name of the congressman. Oh, got it. Okay, so there was an episode earlier than this incident in which a congressman said something against Jackson, and Sam Houston found this guy outside and caned him, just beat him to the ground for the thing that the other guy had said against Jackson. So at this later period, when there are these two congressmen who are aggressively anti-Jackson, Jackson, in a full room of people, says someone should Houstonize those two men. So he literally is saying someone should beat them, right? First of all, he makes up the word Houstonize, which it's pretty good, whatever you think of Jackson. But he basically says someone should beat those men, and the two men arm themselves because they assume that that's an order, a command, and that this will now happen. That's in and of itself really striking. And actually also, and this is part of what had me interested in that book, invisible, right? It's not something you would see. A lot of this bullying, some of it's performative and it's meant to have an audience and to have an impact because of that audience. And some of it is less obvious, but no less powerful. I think I said somewhere in one of the tweets, it's easy to dismiss bullying, but we shouldn't. It's easy to say, oh, it's just bluster. But first of all, just bluster still can have a dramatic impact if your whole job is based on public opinion. And humiliation can drive people to, extreme responses. So I don't think we should dismiss bullying. I think it really has, as my comment suggested, a real power that's worth acknowledging and thinking about, and then thinking about how that really does skew or can skew the balance of power and what that means and what the proper response might be.
So just as a follow-up to that, so I think what stands out to me in what you're saying is this would, in my thinking, have a dramatic effect on separation of powers, right? Like it seems like this would be something that would really kind of push what we understand as separation of powers. Am I reading it right, or what do you think?
What I'm trying to remember is if anyone said that at the time. I mean, if we're not talking about what people thought at the time period, then yeah, if a president says, we need to beat up some of my opponents in Congress, that's a problem. Right. And that really that's kind of overriding checks and balances. But at the time, in part because of these were violent times when manhood and violence were kind of linked with each other. And so some of the behavior I'm talking about here, it wasn't necessarily easy to just say it was wrong. That affected some of what was acceptable or not acceptable concerning this behavior. I mean, a great example, there's an instance in the, I think, early 1850s late 1850s, when someone is writing a letter and he's at his desk and he says he sees someone come into, I believe it's the House, and confront a congressman. And the person, the stranger, his fists are clenched and clearly he's upset. And so this guy, as he's writing the letter, he's like, like, I don't know what's going on over there, but doesn't look good. And he explains that, the stranger is actually smaller than the guy who's being confronted. So he's like, it's a fair fight, basically. They're doing whatever they're doing. And he goes back to what he's doing, right? There might be a fist fight over there, but I don't care. But when he thinks he sees a weapon in the stranger's pocket, he jumps out of his seat and stands behind the stranger. As long as the stranger doesn't pull the weapon, it's a fair fight. But once he pulled the weapon, this guy was going to grab him, which tells you the degree to which they are really, in some way that we don't fully grasp nowadays, judging fairness and unfairness and manhood and violence. They're all bundled together in a really interesting way in this earlier time period.
That's amazing. So switching gears just a little bit, we're running short on time, so I'm gonna try to get through two more questions.
Okay.
The first one's from Annie, which is, I would like to know more about how shame worked on slave owners in 1850, particularly slave owners, because shame seems to be an issue today. So more on shame and slave owners?
Well, a kind of general example has to do with, who is it who stands up and does this? It might be Calhoun. Stands up and is outraged because there are petitions, anti-slavery petitions, in which Southerners are being called barbarians and people are trying to shame them on the subject of slavery. And almost, if you think about it, not surprisingly, Calhoun stands up and says something like, basically, how dare they? How dare they even attempt to suggest that? There are only two possible ways to respond to that kind of attempt to shame us. And one is to ignore it, and the other is to knock the man down who wrote it. And ignoring it is probably, as he's suggesting, maybe not possible. So they're not even buying into the fact that that's shame, right? A lot of these slaveholders are not ashamed of slavery in any way. So if someone's trying to shame them, like shame on you for engaging in slavery, that's not going to be a very effective argument for a lot of these Southerners who are more engaged in a rights conversation about their rights and their property rights being affected and their way of life being attacked. And they don't feel any shame at all about, their peculiar institution and the way that they live based on it.
There's some echoes that we could learn from there, from what you described. That's really helpful. Question from Gloria, longtime friend of the show. Is bullying gender-based? Can women be bullies in politics?
Interesting. Gloria, another good question. Well, in the earlier period, you don't really see women bullying, but what you do see is occasionally, and here you get back to the last question about shame. Sometimes what you do see is women noticing an insult, and because they noticed it, the person who was insulted feels shamed because a woman noticed it, which is very different from sort of general shaming. If a woman sees you being humiliated, that has a real power, and then suddenly the stakes rise way up. And that's true even back to the late 18th century, you see that happen. So in a sense, a woman could bully in the sense that she could respond to something in a way that would enable her to have a kind of power and would force men to do something that they might not otherwise do. As far as today, I think it's quite possible, yet she persisted. But I think also sometimes it's bound up in gender issues, like, how do you treat women or not treat women? I think nowadays, boy, is that a complicated question. I'm not even going to go there. But yeah, I think women can be bullied, but sometimes the bullying, in a sense, as we're seeing now, is so deeply grounded on gendered biases and assumptions that they don't work. How dare she say a bad word? Really? So yeah, gender plays a role, but it plays a role in different ways.
That's wonderful. We got time for one more. Is that okay?
Go for the one more.
All right. Melissa Elliott asks. She asked a couple of great questions. This one is about George Washington. Did anyone remind Southerners that George Washington tried to control his temper, and so should they?
Well,
did they invoke? I guess the question is, did they invoke the founders?
Well, so here's what the Southerners probably would have told you about their anger. If they stood up and said something like, "Are you calling me a liar?" They would say it in that tone. But if someone says that to you, what a Southerner is saying is, "You want to duel me? Because I'm totally willing to do that." That's not anger, actually. And part of honor culture has to do with being able to restrain your outrage, and to be threatening and be cool at the same time. Now, granted, sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, and you get a guy with a cane, or a gun,
Right,
like rushing at somebody, and that's not what's supposed to happen. And very often there will be other people, often Southerners, kind of pulling them back, like that's not the way to behave. But I think, generally speaking, Southerners were able to be very effective at bullying and having a lot of power, and seemingly not even raising their voice. And dueling had a lot to do with that. Eventually there's an anti-dueling law passed that John Quincy Adams really supports, and it's basically a congressional anti-dueling law because it largely only affects Washington and the area. But when Adams is arguing to defend that, to promote it, he says it totally destroys the balance of power in Congress because Southerners use it all the time and they have control because of it. We need to make it so that it doesn't happen. And if it does happen, there's a big punishment. So he right out and right says precisely what we've been talking about for this hour today, which is there's a power in bullying that needs to be addressed, even if it doesn't seem like it's more than just bullying.
That's really helpful. And so I'll leave the last word to you, and thank everybody for your time today. And we'll look forward to look for messages from us, because we're going to have a plan for the next couple of weeks. We promise. We just have to sit and talk about it. So
indeed, yeah, Matt and I have to decide what we want to do, but just like on Thanksgiving, we had a pre-recorded brief Thanksgiving episode. I want us to have a continuing streak of Thursdays. So he and I will think about something to do for, I guess it's the 24th, right? December 24th. So anyway, yeah, do indeed watch on Twitter and on the NCHE website and wherever, because we will come up with a plan. Meanwhile, let me back up and say, as always, I want to thank you all for coming, and particularly for coming to address this topic, which, when I wrote my book, it wasn't when I began my book, it wasn't timely in any way, bullying in politics, and it keeps becoming more and more timely in a way that is not pleasing, but is important. And as always, every week we try to link past and present, and this seems like very much right in front of our face as a connection between past and present. And I think it's worth wrestling with what it means and what does that suggest about the incoming administration that should very aggressively say it represents all Americans, but that also should, stand up for what it represents. And I don't know what that means. But at any rate, thank you all for coming. Thank you for making this a community, as we always are every Thursday. And we may not officially see you next week, but we will be there. Watch for the announcement, and then we will see you after the holidays. In the meantime, everybody stay safe. Have a wonderful holiday. Embrace your loved ones. See you soon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. And I'll look forward to seeing some of you tonight.